Thank you, Branka. Yeah, I fully subscribe to the arguments Laura and Valina raised, and actually, there is a huge problem in controlling the autonomous systems. There's something else. Those systems will be programmed with an algorithm in a laboratory without taking into account the life um, conditions in which they will be used, and that's something that I think should and does scare military commanders also, because the last thing a military commander wants is losing control of the means he's using in warfare. Uh, and that was something I think already in 2014, 13, 14, when we had the first meetings of the GGE, there was a consensus amongst military that no military want fully autonomous weapon system because then they lose control over it. And that's might seem contradictory with the position they now have during the negotiations, but maybe later on we can come back on that. And the dehumanization of the decision also to kill is also very important for the military, because after all, military are human beings with the military training, let's say, and they are genuinely attached to the military ethics they received and during their training, and giving the right or the decision to kill to a robot is ethically unacceptable also for military. And I'd like to quote John McBride, a Canadian colleague who wrote an open letter for the military. And he said the decision to kill by a robot would not be the result of the skills, knowledge, intelligence, training, experience, humanity, morality, and the situational awareness and understanding of the laws of war that men and women in uniform used to make. So there's a whole complex decision-making process in warfare, which includes, of course, the experience, the humanity also of the military using it. And that is something we would lose with the fully autonomous weapon system. Of course, there's also entails possible human errors, and that's something that's normal when human beings are taking decisions, but that should not be a reason to fully rely on autonomous weapon system, which, as some argue, which are making much less errors than human beings, but which I can't subscribe, because we already discussed on that. Those systems are programmed in a sterile environment and are not really prepared to be used in the complexity, certainly, and the actual complexity of war situations.
Thank you, Lotte, for that. I know there's discussion about using simulated data, right? So that you would simulate the conflict environment. But I always think, anyone with any insights into what a conflict zone is actually like understands the dynamic nature of a conflict zone, the shifts that happen. And, there are very real, I think, concerns about using this sort of simulated data, because how can you simulate some of these environments, which, are really quite unpredictable. And that's why I'm glad all of you brought up this issue of unpredictability and how much of a concern it can be. And I really thought that we needed to focus primarily on sort of military uses and applications of AI, because some of the concerns, there's a tendency to kind of separate it out a bit from other concerns of uses of AI. So we're quite willing to talk about, concerns about uses of AI by governments and in healthcare and health systems. But then when it comes to the military applications of AI, there is this reticence a bit to speak about it. And in my view, all of the possible risks, when you think about issues of bias, hacking, data poisoning, Vanina mentioned this, right? Among others, these are much more acute concerns in military contexts. So how important do you think is it to address this sort of, or is there this need to raise awareness that at least I'm perceiving? Maybe Vanina, if you want to start us off, and then Laura and Loda.
Yes. So, like you, as you said, so all these issues that we find that current AI systems have apply to basically any system that would use AI technology, right? But then, if that is a weapon or a military device, then the effects of a malfunctioning device will be much noticeable at a scale, and also you are putting people physically in danger, right? Maybe in the civilian domain, we can discuss long about it, but the physical harm might not be that clear, though you can have like psychological harm and social harm and a lot of other types of harms that are very important. But I think that, like you said, I mean, I have this kind of I don't know really how to handle the discussion, but I don't know if we can talk about AI in the general sense and all the problems that AI have, and just that, because like the military domain is so much disruptive in that sense, like in globally disrupted. So I like this idea that I kind of borrowed from medicine or health, that they started to try to characterize the systems, the AI-based systems that are for medical use exclusively. So I think that gives us a very nice opportunity to kind of separate the domains. But then, as you know, that it is an AI model, every problem that you have in the civilian context also applies to the other ones. But then in the military, so we can think as AI-based military devices, right? And so those have to be treated and thought of differently in terms of regulations, though the basic problems are the same than in the civilian domain. So I think there is a lot of things. Also, the European Union is working on legislation, and they are trying to address specifically high-risk AI systems, right? Systems and domains. I think that's a too broader word, like high risk. What do you mean high risk? You can have medical high risk systems, military high risk. So I think it is quite important to try to define the scope of the discussion, and to put it like in military terms, in the military context, we can actually like kind of define the parameters that we have to look at, and say if and when we want these devices to operate, and with which degree of autonomy, right? Because it's not just autonomous lethal weapons. There is a whole spectrum of military devices that are being developed as we speak, right? And those probably we won't be able to prohibit, or we might actually not want to prohibit all of them, right? But they have to be regulated. So we have to think of all these devices kind of in a special box that we have to look carefully when we talk about the problems that they can have and the ways we can mitigate those problems and regulate their functioning.
Laura, maybe you have some thoughts.
A couple of thoughts. I think bias is a particularly interesting one to bring up, because I think if we looked at even military targeting now, we'd probably see a fair bit of bias if we looked. And in fact, some people have looked. I think a lot of people have pointed out that the sort of the normal run of warfare these days is not nation states going after each other with fighter planes and tanks. we have a new norm, which is asymmetric warfare, where you have a technologized Western military or militaries fighting against irregular combatants who are not marking themselves out with a uniform and so forth. And in this world, we already see an awful lot of bias towards military-aged males who are preferentially targeted, particularly military-aged males of particular races. So, I could certainly point out a number of papers that point this out. If we look at, say, something like in Fallujah, Operation Vigilant Resolve a few years back, and they put a cordon around the city, told all the civilians to get out, but they let the women and children out and they kept the males in. So, there's already bias here. When people say that autonomous weapons are going to have so much precision and going to be so great, a lot of people have pointed out that there's actually 3 aspects to precision. There's kind of precision of targeting. So I point at this coordinate and I hit it. That's, kind of location-based precision targeting. Then there's blast radius. When I hit that target, how big is the blast? And then there's the third element of precision, which is how precisely am I selecting valid combatants? And, we already have the first 2 things pretty much solved, right? A commando raid is about as precise location-wise and blast radius as you can get, right? Of course, militaries don't like to use those in these days of cheap, nice drones. They like to use these kinds of more technology-driven methods. But it's the target selection aspect that people keep talking about in terms of both drone warfare and now autonomous weapons. The problem is the expectation that this very difficult, the most difficult part of the 3 parts of precision can be solved with autonomous weapons is basically just treating machine learning and technology as a silver bullet, which it is not. And we have seen that in so many elements of the ways that we've tried to use these technologies in civilian life in the recent past, right? It's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to be magic. So, the people who say that, these things are going to solve precision and they won't have bias, there's no justification for that statement. So, these things are going to have inherent bias, I think. It's going to be built into them. As for hacking, we should always worry about that. We've already seen video feeds from predators be hacked. I think there's no reason to think that these tempting targets would be ignored. I think, militaries will do whatever they can. And we know that certainly all of the militaries of the world put a very significant amount of effort into hacking each other's nations. And I think it would be very naive to think that these things won't be hacked. And, that as well is obviously something that could be a very significant stability and sort of, strategic corporal type issue, like we talked about in the previous part of the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Before I go to Loda, maybe I can direct this a little bit more towards him about this issue of precision, right? And I don't think anyone wants to argue against precision. We can, say that we should have better, more precise weaponry. But the concern is also that, I was reading something recently about the precision paradox. You'll only have so many, precise weapons, and then your adversaries will adapt as well. It's not like the adversaries aren't going to go into urban areas. And this is precisely, I think, what Laura is bringing up in different, contexts in Iraq and in Syria. What we've seen is, particularly non-state actors will go into densely populated urban areas, and then it becomes this war of attrition, right? It becomes this sort of this battle where you really are attempting to wear down the whatever troops had the technological advantage initially. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about this this idea, Loda, of this greater precision. It's almost like a cult of precision when it comes to new technologies and weaponry.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because, of course, as we see the evolving technology, there are a lot of benefits of autonomy for the military. We should admit that and acknowledge this. And so we have kind of paradox that from one side that technology can be more precise, can in certain circumstances also limit the collateral damage from less precise weapons. And so from military point of view, it's very tempting to rely on that and to push it further on, because it's a really great help for the military commander in battle. We already saw now in the latest conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, where you saw that the party with the most advanced autonomous weapon system actually had the biggest military advantage, and could decide the conflict due to its technological advance. So yes, from that side, it's very tempting. It has benefits, and it's tempting to use it. The problem is that at a certain moment, what I call the red line will be very thin, because military could be blinded by all these benefits and advantages, and not even be aware they are crossing the red line, because it's not just a black and white image, because we have now this position who is acceptable, and then suddenly we are shifting to a situation that is no longer acceptable. It's shifting more slowly and with incremental steps, actually, and I'm afraid that at a certain moment, blinded by the advantages and the benefits of autonomy in weapon system, that the military will cross the red line without being aware of it. And that's something that should be well observed, because often when we are talking about little autonomous weapon systems, we are talking about weapon systems in the future. But it's also very interesting to look at the existing weapon systems and analyze the status of meaningful human control in those weapon systems. Latest report on the air defense systems show that actually meaningful human control in those systems is really decreasing, and at the point that, yes, okay, where you can question the meaningfulness, let's say, of the human control, because indeed the human still has control over the system, but what's meaningful, and those systems already exist. So that's what I wanted to point out. If we are really shifting slowly to the red line, and at a certain moment that red line will be that thin that we will cross it, or the military will cross it without being aware of it, because it is the decision time of 1 or 2 seconds is that's still meaningful for an air defense system when you can. So it's really a very interesting question, but also it's really concerning. That's something that should be pointed out, and that's also something we'd like to reach out to the military, because I've been military myself in the past, and I joined technological advances as a pilot too, and I know it's very tempting to rely fully on those systems, because it is your life, and then in a more broader picture, it gives you a huge military advantage. But yeah, that's something that's concerning, scares me, that at a certain moment we will cross the red line without being aware of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Odin. It's hard to reconcile this sort of focus on precision with the knowledge of the brittleness of the systems and the unpredictability, and the varying contexts, and some of the ideas of applying some of these technologies in very dynamic, what are very dynamic situations and environments. So it's this challenge of everyone, I think, trying to understand, where are those red lines precisely, where are the biggest concerns? Because I think it's important to keep bringing attention to various applications so that we understand which applications are we as a global community okay with, and which ones are we not. And this tendency to be seen, by people who are perhaps a bit more concerned about technological uses, to be perceived as techno-skeptics, and it's not about that. It's more about understanding, really the impact of these applications, of these technologies. And so I think what really is also a question that is brought up often in these discussions is, where are we now? Trying to understand in the near term, how concerning are the applications and uses of AI by militaries? And how do you, maybe a sort of a broader question, and this is something I'm quite interested in, how do you see these technologies transforming or changing warfare? And what sort of issues and concerns should we be focusing on now? I know there's a lot there, but just maybe, Laura, if you have some thoughts on, what is it in the near term that we need to be thinking about, and how do we respond sort of in the near term?
Yeah, so I think we're in this really dangerous place where I think we've seen that it's quite easy to build a bad autonomous weapon system, something that's going to be brittle, something that's going to surprise operators, something that may include bias. And I think it's impossible for the foreseeable future to build one that will have judgment and awareness of context that will be anywhere approaching comparable to a human being, or even, frankly, comparable to my cat. It's impossible. So this is the place that we're at. We can build the bad stuff, we cannot build the good stuff. Even if we were to decide that a perfectly discriminate killer robot was a good and ethical thing to build, we cannot do it. So where are we going? I think what we're going to see, and what we kind of are seeing with the likes of the Turkish Kargu drone, is small drones with sort of creeping autonomous features. The Kargu, for example, its marketing bills it as having advanced facial recognition capabilities, which is quite concerning. It's one of these sort of small drones, large domestic, small commercial, kind of able to lift 1.5 kilos of explosives. So I think we're, when we get into these sorts of small and cheap things, I think these things become quite attractive and accessible to pretty much any military force around the world. So I think we need to be very, very concerned about proliferation of these kinds of things, and focused about and concerned about features creeping in. I think the Kargu and its the high degree of autonomy that it's been advertised as having, and the facial recognition features are quite concerning. The most recent report of the National Institute of Standards and Technology that talks about non-cooperative facial recognition basically comes out and says that the technology, the best non-cooperative facial recognition, is not good enough to make any substantial decision based on. Non-cooperative is where you just have something that's taking photos from an arbitrary angle, as opposed to standing on the footprints and looking at the camera. So I think it's just very concerning to see that militaries are in fact building this kind of technology into weapons at the moment. So I'm quite concerned.
Vanina, maybe, and then Lode, if you have any concerns in the near term.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. I think that's the imminent problem, right? We don't have artificial intelligence. We have like stupid systems that are that we are using constantly in a lot of things in our daily lives. And if that is going to go to weapons, like you can, like Laura was saying, you can very easily build this kind of things, right? So and the AI in this sense is just like it's something that it will power any kind of device that could harm people. It would make it even more potent or more dangerous, right? Without thinking about control or intelligence or anything like that, right? So I think that it's very important for us, like you say, like it's hard to think about predictability with all these things that don't work, right? Like the systems don't seem to be working, and don't seem to be able to be predictable. But anyhow, I think we have to keep working and to keep thinking on what do we mean by predictability, and especially how can we measure it in any automated system, right? So if we want to put some kind of limits, if we want to write some regulation, we have to understand to what extent these devices can harm us. So I'm talking as a scientist. So I see this need of working towards. So what does it mean for this particular kind of systems to be predictable, to be reliable, to not have to don't have bias? So what does that mean actually from a technical point of view? Do we have a way? So if I give you a system, can you check that? I know that it could be a double, like it could be dangerous also to have that kind of things. But from like academic point of view, I think it's important to start to put like more concrete manageable words in place that we can actually start to do something about it. Like we don't in any part of this world we allow drugs to be out in the world without being tested appropriately with a specific protocol that we may agree or not that is the best for any particular kind of drugs, but we do that, and there is an agency that actually looks at that, and they have ways to measure the properties that we expect from a drug, right? These systems are going to be built, and things that today may look like harmless, with a very simple software update can become something that can bring us a lot of problems. So like coming back to your question about like this division between AI from the civilian point of view or the military point of view, I think we are like kind of like in a mess in the middle, because the dual use of the AI models are make us very hard to think of any possible like umbrella regulation that would cover anything, right? So I think we are in I mean it's a good thing that we are discussing about it, and we are interchanging opinions and our knowledge about it. So how can we actually control this and not allow this the scenarios that Laura is describing to actually happen? And they will happen pretty soon. They are happening as we are speaking right now, right? So those are my concerns.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, and Loda, I'm sorry to keep interjecting before I ask you, but Jonathan just made this great point, and I think that's what you were alluding to earlier. It's not just about the technology, right? I think all of you have at one point, in this discussion pointed out, it's not just the technology. The technology might improve in certain ways. It might fail in other ways, differently than humans would. But what the actual concern is about accountability and who is accountable for the decision-making systems. So the decisions made by these systems. So in your thinking about, I think, the future of warfare, how do you see accountability fitting in there for the military, like from a military perspective? I know in Australia, for example, there's been research done where soldiers are really reluctant to trust these kinds of systems, right? And this is something I don't think the Australians really expected to come out of the research study, and we're quite happy, weren't happy with it. But I think it's really important to also think about, the trust in these systems and also levels of accountability. So if you have any thoughts, Loda.
Yeah, indeed, it's a very important point, because when reaching out to the military, it's also one of the arguments I like to use. It's the accountability. Very often in these discussions, we are speaking about an accountability gap. Yeah, that's one way of talking. I would rather say there's no accountability gap, because there's always a way to find a responsible. The question is it the right responsible? Is it the right person being held accountable for it? And that's a concern military should have, because when reaching out, I tell them, do you want to be accountable for the errors made by a system you cannot control? And because that's something that, in fact, when looking for responsible for somebody to be accountable for an error, it's very difficult to hold a system, a machine accountable for something. If we are talking about trials, we won't have a robot judged in trial, and it's going to be a human being, and most probably will be the military commander or at a certain level who use that weapon system that will be held accountable. So that's really a concern they should be aware of, but it's it's a big question at the accountability. I think we can talk for some weeks about it, but and that's something that that will take some time to really have a good insight of it. But from my point of view, when reaching out to military, and then I try to raise awareness about that. And I also want to join Evelina in the aspect of dual use. We have a dual use technology here, so it's impossible to ban the development of artificial intelligence. Of course, it's a system that's used in every day and in our daily life. So we will have to limit the harm it can cause, let's say, in military systems, and that's not that easy. There will be a way to find it, I'm sure, but it needs a mind shift also in discussing an international instrument, because we are talking, it needs another vocabulary, another approach of banning or regulating a system. And the fact that the dual use system, that's is that the technology is available and rather easily available. It's not that expensive, if you want. So there's a huge risk of proliferation of harm systems with artificial intelligence, also from non-state actors. And that's something we should also keep in mind, that if we don't have a really quickly a regulating system or an export control system, let's say, on the technology of artificial intelligence for weapon systems, we could have a proliferation of those systems, and also amongst non-state actors, something we should keep in mind too.
Well, thank you so much for that, Loda. I think it's really important, this question of accountability, because, you know, that really, I think, gets to the core of the issues: who is responsible for the decisions made by the system, and also if these systems are black boxes, you know, how do we understand what is happening? And I really would like to see more discussion on, you know, data and how data is obtained for some of these systems, because a U.S. official had a few months ago pointed out that, you know, for AI to be useful to the US military, they need boutique data. But what is boutique data? What does that look like? Where is that information obtained? And then what does it mean for, the world, really, about the kind of information that would be needed for that level of, I guess, relevance for the US military? So there's so many interesting, I think, aspects to this discussion. And there are some questions also coming in. So I do want to get to some of them at least. And I know that we haven't really, you know, touched on the kinds of, I guess, policy responses. Like, what would you like to see? You know, what do you think would be effective at, whether it's the global level or national? What kind of regulation do you think would be helpful? And you know, we could say it's, you know, a multi-level, right? We need multi-level responses to some of these issues. But is there some sort of legislation and something you'd really like to see, and some regulation that you think would be sort of helpful in addressing some of the concerns you've all laid out? Maybe Laura and Loda and then Vanina.
Yeah, so I think, well, I mean, I am not a lawyer. I'm very much not a lawyer. Don't even play one on TV. But, you know, what the campaign has been consistently calling for is to retain the existing sort of norm of the positive obligation for meaningful human control over the use of force. So basically, you want to keep humans in control. There are tricky parts about defining control. You know, control as in a human can intervene, or a control which I think is not sufficient. I think a positive decision needs to be made by a human being. Then there's also questions around meaningful, that boils down to sort of things like, does the human being have enough time to make a decision? Do they have enough context and situational awareness to make that decision? And that can even include things like, have they had training about the sort of failure modes of any system that they're using, and about issues around automation bias. There's a whole bunch of very troubling questions around the area of automation bias and around perception. There's some interesting research that's been done that shows that human perception mediated through video is not as good as a human being in the actual situation, which I think many of us would probably find fairly easy to believe given the limitations of the medium. So I think even this sort of regulation around human control on remote weaponry leaves some things to be desired, but I think it's certainly better than a sort of a free-for-all autonomous weapons future. So probably said enough. I'll let you move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, Loda, if you have any thoughts on regulation.
I think that the dual track approach, having on the one side prohibiting fully autonomous weapon systems that are really out of human control, and on the other hand, as Laura said, having positive obligations to maintain meaningful human control, and military systems is very important. But as I said previously, it's challenging because it's very challenging to have some legal language around it, because I think as we see at the CCW, it's already very challenging to have a common understanding about the different aspects of meaningful human control, even about the definition of lethal autonomous weapon systems. It's even more challenging to have the right language, legal language, to implement first that ban and the positive obligations. So, and it's challenging, but it's very important, and it's very important that it's done rather quickly, because not only the technological progress is going much faster than the diplomatic talk. That's not a surprise. And secondly, we also it's important to have clear language to be able to convince those states and those military that are still reluctant to have a ban, because there's a lot of resistance from military and states on a ban or regulating the meaningful human control of weapons, because they don't know what we are talking about, and everybody wants to protect a bit his. To say it a bit ironically, the military wants to protect their new toys, to be sure that those autonomous weapon systems with meaningful human control can still be used, because we said it before, there are also good applications of artificial intelligence in military systems. So they want to preserve that and be sure that they can go on using it. So there's a need for a very quick common understanding about definitions and the framework which we are talking, to be able to convince reluctant stakeholders, let's say, in those negotiations.
Thank you, Loda. Vanina, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Lo that it's very difficult to start top down, right? But I think that has to be done. But then we can also try to work bottom up, right? So if we can start putting some limits and specifications and standards and regulations on the AI models themselves, and then, like I said before, like treat this kind of special systems that are AI-based military devices I think that the construction bottom up and probably locally to global could be very helpful in trying to also kind of like find the correct language and the definitions that we are looking for. Because my worry is that from a top-down process, it's going to be too slow, and then we're going to have these devices in our like Laura was saying, like flying around, and then it will be too late. So I think we like there are a lot of organizations and the states and local power that are trying to at least try to define within the limits of different countries or different regions what an AI system should do, what it's allowed to do. And in that sense, I think it is possible to think in this kind of organizations that we have, the kind of agencies that I don't know who would like actually rule them in a sense, right? Like, is it going to be the state or private corporations, or a combination of them? I really don't know. It's a whole different discussion. But to start analyzing the systems, the AI systems, and the autonomous systems in general that we put out there, right? And start like picking them apart and saying, okay, this is acceptable for now. We will see in the next update if it is still acceptable or not, and things like that, right? Like a lot of other fields in our world work, and I think that would be very, very useful for the global decisions as well.
Well, thank you so much. You know, you've said it, all of you have pointed out that this is challenging. It's not easy, right? I think we all kind of understand that, and the complexity of the fact that these are multi-use technologies and trying to draw some lines and trying to separate out particular uses. But in laying it all out, I think you kind of actually compartmentalized it a bit for us and provided some also responses, right? These multi-level responses that we do need from the bottom up, and we do need these international discussions. And I'm really glad we hadn't sort of focused solely on autonomous weapons. We've talked about them a lot today, but we haven't focused on them solely. But it became very clear that there is this understanding or this need for human control, and the challenge of establishing that, I think, the good news is that there are people working on this, and there is a diplomatic community that is quite aware of these issues. So I think the more responses we see from different levels of government, from different actors, you know, that this is something that everybody kind of has a bit of a role to play in ensuring that level of human control is maintained over these technologies. At one of the UN meetings, Lotte referenced CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. You know, one of the diplomats said the specter, and then there was a joke made by the chair that the specter haunting the discussion is the Black Mirror episodes, if you've seen these dystopian sort of futures. So it's been great that you've shown us that this dystopian future is not necessary. There are two very quick questions that I want to get to from the chat and discussion, and I apologize that we can't get to them all. But one is about police use and law enforcement uses. We're seeing this a lot with drones, and I think in borders. If Laura, quickly you want to address, you know, is there a way to ensure regulation of these systems, you know, to law enforcement, or is it, you know, a matter of ensuring that certain things are just not created and then they won't be in the hands of the law enforcement agencies? And then very quickly, you know, we're a Canadian organization. We have quite a Canadian audience. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs has a mandate to support international discussions on autonomous weapons. And Lotte, maybe just a question of, you know, is there something that Canadians need to do to ensure that this issue is raised more often? Laura, and then Lotte quickly, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we absolutely do need to worry about, we should have the same concerns around autonomous weapons in a policing context. I think in a policing context, we also need to worry about, I think, non-lethal autonomous weapons. There's a number of models of riot control drone, for example, that you can get. They're not autonomous yet, but there are remotely controlled drones that will fire things like the pepper pod things and rubber bullets and so forth, and also paint pellets. So I think we could absolutely see things like that becoming more autonomous, and border controls and border policing. Particular concern in Ireland here, where we have the UK has hired Palantir to police the borders up in the north. Delightful choice. Sometimes you don't even get a national choice yourself in this. I think the political issue, particularly around policing, if not border control, is a little bit different in that I think that it will be probably easier to mobilize political support against the use of autonomous police weapons against one's own population, because I think there's a more sort of direct interest there. So I think that's one big difference politically.
Thank you so much, Laura and Loden.
Yeah, sure. Canada can play a role in the negotiation. And Canada has a very good, or had a good reputation in disarmament, humanitarian disarmament. So they have a voice that other states listen to when they are engaging in this kind of discussions. So they could be very active in different ways. First of all, they could support and strengthen the Belgian presidency, because I'm double-headed, working for a Canadian organization but being Belgian. So Belgium is taking up the presidency of the group of governmental experts in the CCW, and it was good. It would be good to have Canada, who has good relationships with the Belgians on disarmament, to keep the ambitions of the presidency high. Because it's good to see that Belgium is taking some initiatives, but we'd like to see a bigger ambition to have really a legally binding instrument. And then furthermore, I think Canada can always also play a role in moving on the discussions and preparing a possible failure within the CCW, because we all know how difficult it is to reach consensus within that disarmament forum. So maybe it could be good already to prepare that in the view of the review conference, to think about alternative possibilities and to take these discussions forward, and to have as soon as possible a legally binding international instrument.
Thank you so much. I could talk about all of this with you for hours, but we have to leave it here. So thank you to the excellent panelists for their important insights, my colleagues and Kelsey Gallagher in particular for helping with the event today. You've been an excellent audience. I know there are still questions. Please do get in touch with us if you have further questions. We will pass them on to the panelists. We will aim to respond to anything that we can ourselves. So thank you so much, and please continue talking about these topics, and we will be here with you to share in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Hope to see you soon.